On the freezing night of January 1st, 1781, George Washington's most battle-hardened soldiers decided they were done fighting the British. Instead, they loaded their muskets, fixed their bayonets, and turned their weapons on their own officers. They dragged artillery pieces out of the snow, aimed them at the headquarters, and prepared to blow their own commanders to pieces. This was not a riot by fresh recruits. This was the Pennsylvania Line, the absolute backbone of the Continental Army. Men who had survived the slaughter at Brandywine, the frozen hell of Valley Forge, and the brutal heat of Monmouth. If these men quit, the American Revolution was over. The British would not even have to fire another shot. The army would simply eat itself alive from the inside. But what makes this night so incredible is not just that the army mutinied. It is what happened when the British tried to buy them off, and how one desperate lie almost cost America its independence forever. Imagine standing in the freezing mud, watching the men you bled with suddenly pointing their guns at your chest. The fate of a new nation was suddenly hanging by a thread, held hostage by the very men who had sworn to protect it. How did Washington's elite forces reach this breaking point? And how did a group of starving, freezing soldiers pull off the most disciplined and terrifying mutiny in American military history? The answer starts with a broken promise. To understand why the most lethal soldiers in America suddenly turned their guns on their own generals, you have to look at a massive, unforgivable lie. Back in 1777, the war was going terribly. The Continental Congress was desperate. They needed men to stay in the army for the long haul, not just a few months. So, recruiters went through the ranks of the Pennsylvania Line with a brand new contract. The terms were simple: enlist for 3 years or during the war. To a common soldier, those words meant whichever came first. If you survive 36 months, you get to go home. But the politicians and generals had a very different, highly convenient interpretation. They decided the contract actually meant these men were trapped in the army until the British surrendered, even if it took a decade. For 3 years, this toxic misunderstanding quietly simmered. By the brutal winter of 1781, that 3-year mark had finally expired. The men were camped at Jockey Hollow, New Jersey, and the conditions were a living nightmare. It was actually worse than Valley Forge. The snow was 2 feet deep. Men were leaving bloody footprints in the ice because they had no shoes. They were wrapped in filthy rags, starving, and covered in lice. They had not seen a single paycheck in over 12 months. And then came the ultimate insult. Recruiting officers strolled into this frozen hellscape offering brand new recruits, men who had never even seen a British bayonet, 25 gold coins just to sign up. Meanwhile, the hardened veterans were told they had to stay indefinitely for 0 pay because of a legal loophole. You can ask men to starve, you can ask them to bleed, but you cannot ask combat veterans to rot in the snow for free while handing gold to rookies right in front of their faces. That was the spark. The powder keg was about to blow. It happened on New Year's Day, January 1st, 1781. Most elite American officers were tucked away inside their warm quarters, drinking to the new year, trying to ignore the freezing cold outside. But out in the muddy, frozen camp, the enlisted men were not celebrating. They were waiting. At exactly 9 o'clock at night, a single skyrocket launched into the pitch-black winter sky. That was the signal. Instantly, the entire camp erupted. Over 1,000 veteran soldiers from the Pennsylvania Line grabbed their weapons. They poured out of their wooden huts, but they were not screaming like a wild, chaotic mob. Instead, they moved with terrifying, dead-silent military precision. They smashed into the main armory and seized the ammunition. Then, they hauled heavy artillery cannons into the snow and pointed them directly at their own officers' quarters. Hearing the commotion, junior officers rushed out into the freezing dark, drawing swords and shouting angry orders to stand down. They fully expected the men to back away in fear. Instead, the veterans leveled their loaded muskets right at them. Captain Adam Bettin ran directly into the mob, trying to physically wrestle a weapon away from a mutinying soldier. A sudden shot rang out in the darkness. Captain Bettin fell backward into the bloody snow, dying almost instantly. 2 other officers were shot in the chaotic crossfire. Panic swept through the command staff. These were not British troops attacking them. These were their own men. The mutineers had just crossed the ultimate line. They had killed an American officer. There was no going back now. Under military law, this was treason, punishable by a firing squad. The soldiers knew it perfectly well, and they simply did not care anymore. The American army was tearing itself apart, and the real nightmare was just beginning. The terrifying noise finally reached the commander of the Pennsylvania Line, General Anthony Wayne. They called him Mad Anthony for a reason. He was utterly fearless, the kind of general who personally led brutal bayonet charges from the front. His men actually respected him. If anyone alive could stop this violent rebellion, it was him. Wayne burst out of his tent into the freezing night, grabbed his dual pistols, and marched straight toward the mass of heavily armed, furious soldiers. He raised his weapons and ordered the men back to their huts immediately. But the mutineers just stared at him. Then, dozens of cold steel bayonets were leveled directly at Wayne's chest. A veteran soldier stepped forward and told the general, "We love you, we respect you, but if you fire those pistols, you are a dead man." Wayne looked at the ring of steel pointed at his heart. He instantly realized that authority, rank, and fear meant absolutely nothing tonight. So, he tried a completely different, highly dramatic tactic. He threw his loaded pistols down into the snow. He ripped open his heavy winter coat, exposing his bare chest to the freezing wind, and shouted, "If you mean to kill me, shoot me now." It was a brilliantly cinematic move, but the soldiers did not pull the trigger. They did not want to kill Wayne. They just wanted their freedom, their back pay, and their dignity. They calmly told Wayne that they were leaving right now. They were marching to Philadelphia to confront the Continental Congress face to face, and no one would stop them. As Wayne watched over 1,000 rogue soldiers form up into perfect marching columns, a chilling realization hit him. If this massive rebel force marched into the capital, the American government would completely collapse. What happened the very next morning terrified the American command even more than the mutiny itself. When you picture a military mutiny, you imagine total chaos, wild looting, and a complete breakdown of order. But the Pennsylvania Line did the exact opposite. As they marched away from their camp toward Philadelphia, they did not turn into a violent mob. Instead, they essentially fired all their commissioned officers and completely reorganized themselves. They elected their own new commanders from within the enlisted ranks. A sergeant named William Buzar was suddenly promoted to lead the entire column. They set up their own strict guards, maintained perfect marching formations, and severely punished any soldier who stepped out of line or tried to loot local farms. They were proving an incredibly dangerous point to the Continental Congress. We do not need elite, wealthy officers to be a highly effective army. We are the army. This extreme level of discipline made them completely unpredictable and highly lethal. They quickly set up camp in Princeton, New Jersey, forming a strong defensive perimeter with their stolen cannons pointing outward. They were now a rogue, heavily armed nation within a nation. General Wayne followed cautiously behind them, completely powerless to stop their movements. He could only send desperate letters ahead to Philadelphia, begging the politicians to prepare for the absolute worst. The Continental Congress went into a state of blind panic. They had absolutely no money to pay these furious men, and no reliable troops to defend the city. Politicians started packing their bags, preparing to flee the capital, just like they had when the British invaded. The government of the United States was about to be overthrown by its own starving soldiers. And right at that very moment, the British finally made their deadly opening move. While Congress panicked in Philadelphia, The most powerful man in America was experiencing his own personal nightmare. General George Washington received the frantic dispatches at his winter headquarters in New Windsor, New York. When Washington finally read that his most elite veteran fighters had killed an officer and gone rogue, he was absolutely horrified. His first instinct was typical of any 18th-century military commander: crush the violent rebellion immediately with overwhelming, deadly military force. But then, a dark, terrifying realization washed over him. He could not send anyone to stop them. Washington's remaining troops, primarily from the New England colonies, were suffering through the exact same freezing, miserable conditions as the Pennsylvania mutineers. They were also starving. They were also completely unpaid. If Washington ordered his New England soldiers to march south and fire upon their starving brothers in arms, there was a massive risk they would simply refuse. Worse, they might cross the battle line, officially join the mutiny, and march on the government together. If that apocalyptic scenario happened, the Continental Army would instantly cease to exist, and the American dream of freedom would die on the spot. Washington was completely paralyzed. The great commander-in-chief was forced to sit in his freezing headquarters and do absolutely nothing while his army tore itself apart. He sent a desperate, pleading warning to local governors, explaining the situation was catastrophic and the entire revolution was hanging by a single, highly fragile thread. The Americans were utterly defenseless. And sitting just a few short miles away in New York City, the commander of the British military was closely watching this chaos unfold with a very sinister smile. He knew exactly how to destroy America completely without firing a single musket. He would simply buy them with British gold and win the war. British General Sir Henry Clinton sat in his comfortable headquarters in New York City, reading intelligence reports that seemed too good to be true. The American army was eating itself alive. George Washington was paralyzed, and the Continental Congress was preparing to flee in absolute terror. For the British, this was not just a lucky break. It was the ultimate opportunity to crush the American Revolution forever. Clinton knew he did not need to send a massive army to fight the Pennsylvania Line. Why risk heavy British casualties when he could simply buy the American soldiers with hard cash? These men were starving, freezing, and felt completely betrayed by their own country. Clinton believed that loyalty had a price tag, and he was more than willing to pay it. He quickly formulated a brilliant, highly deceptive plan. He would send secret spies directly into the mutineer camp at Princeton. These spies carried a handwritten, incredibly tempting offer from the British command. If the Pennsylvania Line dropped their weapons and marched toward British lines, they would receive a full, unconditional pardon for their treason. But the offer did not stop there. Clinton promised to pay them all the back wages that Congress owed them, in real, solid gold, not worthless American paper. And best of all, they would not even be forced to fight for the British Army if they did not want to. They could simply take the gold and walk away as free men. It was a psychological masterstroke. Clinton was offering starving, desperate men everything they had begged their own government for. Two sneaky British operatives slipped through the freezing darkness, carrying this explosive offer directly into the American camp. The fate of the entire war now rested on how these angry, betrayed soldiers would finally answer today. The two British spies slipped quietly through the freezing New Jersey woods, carrying General Clinton's golden ticket. John Mason, a hardened British operative, and James Ogden, his local guide, approached the rebel perimeter at Princeton. They expected to be greeted as absolute saviors by a chaotic mob of starving, angry deserters. When the guards stopped them, Mason proudly demanded to see the mutiny's new leader, Sergeant William Buzar. He was escorted into the camp. Mason confidently handed over the written British offer. He watched the rogue American sergeants read the promises of full pardons, warm food, and real, heavy gold. The camp was dead silent. The tension was completely suffocating. For the mutineers, this was the ultimate crossroads. They had not been paid in years. They were wearing freezing, lice-infested rags. Their own government had lied to them, ignored them, and left them to die in the snow. Now, the enemy was offering them a golden way out. All they had to do was walk away. General Anthony Wayne watched nervously from a distance, completely terrified. He knew that if the sergeants took this deal, he would be a dead man, and the American army would instantly collapse. Mason stood there, smiling, waiting for the rogue soldiers to embrace him. He expected them to pack their bags and march straight to the British lines. But Mason severely miscalculated one crucial detail. He fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. He thought these men were common mercenaries looking for a quick payday. He did not realize that while these soldiers absolutely hated the politicians in Congress, they still fiercely loved the concept of American independence. And they were about to give the British a deeply shocking, violently bloody answer that absolutely nobody in the entire world ever saw coming this night. Sergeant William Buzard looked at the British offer. He looked at the gold, the promises of freedom, and the guarantee of a warm bed. Then he looked dead into the eyes of the British spy, John Mason. Buzard did not smile. He did not negotiate. Instead, he uttered a phrase that completely shattered the British master plan. "We are not Benedict Arnolds." The mutineers were absolutely furious. They were starving, freezing, and felt deeply betrayed by their own government. But they were not traitors. They had bled for the American cause for 3 brutal years, and they were not going to sell their honor for British gold. In a stunning, highly dramatic move, the mutineers immediately arrested the 2 British operatives. They tied them up, dragged them through the snow, and marched straight over to the tent of General Anthony Wayne. The rogue sergeants handed the terrified British spies directly over to the very general they had rebelled against just a few days earlier. Wayne was completely speechless. He realized in that profound moment that these mutineers were not a mindless mob. They were highly disciplined patriots, demanding basic human justice. The 2 British spies were swiftly tried by a military court and sentenced to death by hanging. General Sir Henry Clinton's brilliant psychological trap had spectacularly failed. By trying to buy the mutineers, the British had accidentally reminded them exactly why they hated the crown in the first place. But the crisis was far from over. The soldiers had rejected the British, but their cannons were still pointed directly at the Continental Congress. They still demanded their freedom and their back pay. And the panicked politicians in Philadelphia finally realized that they had absolutely no choice but to sit down and negotiate with a heavily armed American rebel army immediately. The politicians in Philadelphia were backed into a corner. They knew they could not defeat the Pennsylvania Line with military force. So, the Continental Congress sent a man named Joseph Reed, the president of Pennsylvania, to negotiate directly with the rogue sergeants. The stakes were impossibly high. If Reed failed, the army would permanently fracture. Reed rode into the rebel camp with a heavy heart. He sat down with Sergeant William Buzard and the mutineers' elected committee. The soldiers laid out their absolute demands. They wanted the men who had served 3 years to be honorably discharged immediately. They wanted real clothing to survive the brutal winter. And they wanted the back pay they had been promised for years. Reed looked at the hardened, freezing veterans and realized they were not asking for anything unreasonable. They were just asking for the truth. After intense, nerve-wracking discussions, Reed finally caved. He agreed to their terms. The compromise was completely unprecedented. Over half of the entire Pennsylvania line, roughly 1,300 elite soldiers, were officially discharged from the Continental Army on the spot. The government scrambled to find fresh clothes and whatever money they could scrape together for the remaining men. The mutiny was peacefully resolved, and a massive national disaster was narrowly avoided. But this peaceful resolution created a massive, extremely dangerous new problem for George Washington. By giving in to the heavily armed mutineers, the Continental Congress accidentally sent a loud, clear message to the rest of the starving American army. They proved that if you suffer in silence, you get absolutely nothing. But if you grab your musket, point a loaded cannon at your own officers, and threaten to march on the capital, the government will instantly give you exactly what you want. It was a highly toxic precedent. And it did not take long for that dangerous spark to catch fire again. Just a few short days later, soldiers in the New Jersey line looked at the sweet deal the Pennsylvania boys got, and they decided to launch a wildly violent mutiny of their very own later tonight. When the New Jersey line mutinied just 2 weeks later, expecting the exact same sweet deal, General George Washington snapped. He realized that if he allowed one more successful rebellion, the entire Continental Army would completely dissolve into armed gangs. The revolution would end in absolute anarchy. Washington did not negotiate this time. He did not send politicians with promises. He sent General Robert Howe with 600 heavily armed, fiercely loyal troops. They marched silently through the freezing night and completely surrounded the sleeping mutineers' camp. At dawn, Howe ordered the rogue soldiers to parade without their weapons. Then, the brutal reality of military discipline returned. Howe selected the 2 main ringleaders of the New Jersey Mutiny. But he did not order his own loyal men to shoot them. Instead, he forced 12 of the mutineers' closest friends, men who had rebelled alongside them, to form the firing squad. Tears streamed down the faces of the executioners as they raised their muskets. The order was given. The shots rang out. The 2 ringleaders fell dead in the snow. The mutiny was violently crushed in an instant, and the message was permanently burned into the army's mind. There would be no more negotiations. The mutinies of 1781 forced the American government to finally realize they could not fund a war on empty promises. They desperately scrambled to secure foreign loans to properly equip the men. Without that brutal wake-up call, the Continental Army would have never survived to march to Yorktown and ultimately defeat the British Empire forever. If this dark, forgotten chapter of the American Revolution surprised you, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. We uncover the wildest untold military stories every single week, and you will not want to miss what comes next.